An 18-year-old high school dropout nicknamed Samson found out he had been drafted. He was not sent to Korea to fight in the war. Instead, he was ordered to stay at Fort Ord and be the lifeguard for their pool. A year later, Samson was still working at the Fort Ord pool when he decided to take some time off. As a military member, Samson was able to fly for free on any military flight so long as he was in uniform. And so Samson packed up his things, he threw on his uniform, and he made his way over to the Fort Ord airport, where he hopped on a small military plane and he flew to Seattle. A few days later, Samson said goodbye to his family and to his girlfriend, and then he put his uniform back on and made his way to the Seattle airport. When he got there, he saw there was only one military plane that was flying from Seattle all the way down to Fort Ord, and this plane was a World War II era dive bomber that only had enough space for one person, the pilot. Samson had to get back to Fort Ord that night because the following day he had work, and in the Army you can't just not show up for work. And so he approaches this pilot of this dive bomber plane and he says, "Hey, can I just cram into your radar compartment in the back of your plane?" And the pilot, whose name was Anderson, immediately said, "No, that's a terrible idea. It's not meant for passengers. It's barely big enough to fit inside of. You could get badly hurt in there." But Samson was adamant that he had to get back that night, that he'd be in so much trouble if he didn't. And so finally, against his better judgment, Anderson caves and he says, "Okay, Samson, you can come with me." And so a little bit before 4 p.m. that afternoon, Samson eagerly went around to the side of the plane. He opened up a side hatch and he crawled inside of this very tight radar compartment. And once he was tucked up inside, Anderson walked around and he closed the hatch behind him. A few minutes later, the pair was careening down the runway, and right as the plane began to experience lift and was going up into the air, the side hatch of the radar compartment where Samson was suddenly flew open. The big issue with this now open door in the radar compartment was not that Samson, like in the movies, would get sucked out this door out to his death. No, the real problem with this now open door had to do with oxygen levels. At their cruising altitude, where the majority of their flight would be spent, there wasn't enough oxygen in the air to sustain human life, which meant if Samson couldn't find a way to shut that door, he would eventually pass out and suffocate to death. Samson, who was fully aware of this fact, immediately jumped into action by anchoring his feet and legs around the stanchion in the middle of this compartment space, and once he was fairly secure, he began extending his upper body out of the plane to try to grab onto the handle to try to shut it. But once he was holding onto that door handle, he's now halfway out of the plane, he could not get it to shut. The wind was so strong it was pinning the door open. And so eventually he retreated back into the plane and went all the way to the very back of the radar compartment space and tucked himself up behind some equipment. And so he just sat there and prayed. While Samson was dealing with this open door crisis, Anderson was dealing with a crisis of his own. At some point after takeoff, he looked down at his gauges and he realized a terrible mistake had been made. There wasn't enough fuel to get to Fort Ord. And so Anderson grabs his radio and he tries to call out to these surrounding airports to see if there's anywhere he can just emergency land this plane, but all he hears is silence. It would turn out his radio equipment just happened to fail right at this moment. And what also happened to fail right at that moment was Anderson's oxygen supply. And so Anderson knew he had to get to a lower altitude as fast as possible because he would eventually pass out and crash the plane. And so he's burning down towards the water, and as they're coming down in altitude, there was more oxygen in the air. And so Samson, who had eventually passed out from a lack of oxygen, is suddenly revived. And so Samson comes to and he looks, and the door is still wide open, and all he can see is the Pacific Ocean burning up at him. He only had a few seconds to grab onto the stanchion in the middle of the space he's in before they impacted the water. Miraculously, Samson survived the impact, but immediately he was faced with another life and death situation. Once he got to the surface, he's looking around and the water's incredibly choppy and it's very foggy. He can barely see anything. He's looking around for Anderson, not really sure what happened to him, and he looks down the plane towards the front of the plane and he sees Anderson climbing out of the cockpit. And so Samson yells to him and the two men link up and they're able to pull 2 life rafts out of the plane. And so both men then get into each of their rafts right as this plane sinks down below the surface. And so Anderson and Samson begin looking around, wondering what they're going to do, but it's so foggy they can't see land in any direction. They can barely see 10 feet away from themselves. So Anderson pulled out his compass, he looked east and said, "Let's just start paddling." The men had crashed about 2 miles off the coast of Point Reyes, California, which is this big protected shoreline that's about 150 miles north of Fort Ord. And this particular stretch of water that these two men had found themselves in was a known breeding ground for great white sharks. And as soon as it got dark, the water got choppier and choppier until at one point Samson actually was launched out of his raft into the water. He turned around and saw his raft, but it was being pulled away by a current faster than he could swim to it. And so Samson yells out for Anderson, who sees him in the water. Anderson tries his best to paddle over and save Samson, but the current was too strong, and before long, Samson watched as Anderson just disappeared into the fog. And so Samson is swimming in this pitch black water. He can't see anything around him, and all he's probably thinking about is how any minute now, I'm going to run out of energy, and I'm going to sink down, and I'm going to drown, or I'm going to get attacked by sharks, or some combination of the two. But miraculously, after about an hour of swimming in some direction, he broke through the fog, and he saw way off in the distance was a light on what looked like dry land. And so he has this sudden burst of energy, and he swims as hard and as fast as he possibly can. Eventually, he gets to the sandy shores of Point Reyes. As he was pulling himself out of the water and collapsed on the beach, he had given everything to that swim. Unable to stand from pure exhaustion, Samson just began slowly crawling up the beach towards this light he had seen as he was swimming. And it would turn out this light was on the outside of this building that was owned by a radio station. He crawls up the steps and he pounds on the door, and by this point he's hypothermic, he's in shock, he's about to die if he doesn't get any help. And luckily, there's someone inside of this building. They open it up, they see Samson, they don't know what's going on, but they pick him up, they pull him inside, they wrap him in a blanket, and so finally this employee just called the Coast Guard that had a station very close to where they were, and a few minutes later the Coast Guard shows up, they take Samson, and they rush him to their station house where they were able to give him medical treatment which saved his life. It was also at this Coast Guard station where Samson was reunited with Anderson, who had also managed to make his way to shore alive. Samson would go on to serve for 2 more years in the Army. The entire time was spent as a lifeguard at the Fort Ord pool. Then in 1953, after the Korean War ended, Samson's mandatory service came to an end and he was honorably discharged. Samson would go on to become one of the most successful and well-known actors and producers of all time. He has won hundreds of big awards, including 4 Academy Awards and 4 Golden Globe Awards. Samson's real name is Clint Eastwood. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.